Tonight on Bridge City News, new reports say it was a surface-to-air missile which brought down Ukrainian Airlines Flight 752, which killed 176 people, including 63 Canadians. British lawmakers gave final approval for the UK to leave the European Union. And the price of gas is coming down. We speak with the president of Canadians with Affordable Energy, Dan McTagg, to find out why.
Your nation. Your province. Your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Robbins.
Good evening. Thanks so much for joining us. According to new information from U.S. intelligence, officials believe that Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752 was likely shot down by an Iranian surface-to-air missile. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau vowed his government will get more answers after the passenger jet crashed minutes after takeoff in Tehran, Iran, killing 176 people, including 63 Canadians.
In the coming days and weeks, our government will continue to work closely with its partners to ensure that this crash is thoroughly investigated. Canadians have questions, and they deserve answers. Minister Champagne will be speaking with the Iranian Foreign Minister and conveying the need for a thorough investigation into this fatal crash. To the families grieving, know that the Government of Canada and all Canadians are grieving with you. We will support you in the incredible, difficult weeks and months ahead. This somber day comes in the wake of deeply concerning events in Iraq. Canada condemns the missile attacks launched by Iran last night. I am relieved, as are all Canadians, that all personnel deployed in Iraq are safe.
U.S. President Donald Trump said Iran appears to be standing down since the Iranian missile attack on a military base in Iraq.
I'm pleased to inform you the American people should be extremely grateful and happy. No Americans were harmed in last night's attack by the Iranian regime. We suffered no casualties. All of our soldiers are safe, and only minimal damage was sustained at our military bases. Our great American forces are prepared for anything. Iran appears to be standing down, which is a good thing for all parties concerned and a very good thing for the world.
Trump says the United States' response will now be to place new economic sanctions in place until Iran changes its behavior. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney expressed solidarity with Alberta's Iranian community, which lost many members in the plane crash. He says several were in Iran to attend a wedding of University of Alberta postgraduate students.
We understand at least 30 Albertans lost their lives aboard Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752 in one of the largest single disasters for Albertans in our history. We understand that of the 176 passengers whose lives were lost, that at least 63 were Canadians and at least 30 were residents of Alberta. We don't have all of the facts yet, but we do know that a number of distinguished Albertans were aboard that flight, including professors at the University of Alberta, a medical doctor, members of their families, many of them having traveled to Iran to attend the wedding of postgraduate students at the University of Alberta, Arash Purzarabi and Pune Gorji, who were there with many friends and family, many of them fellow students from the University of Alberta.
2 people from Calgary were also killed in the tragic plane crash. One was an employee with Viking Air, and the other was a grade 12 student who attended Western Canada High School. Just under 100 people went to the Alberta Legislature last night to share tears, stories, and to light a candle to remember the Edmontonians killed in the Iranian plane crash. In total, 176 people lost their lives in the crash. Out of those, 63 were Canadians, and half of them were from the city of Edmonton.
It was a tragedy last night. I couldn't sleep at all. I'm a staff at University of Alberta, and I know Professor Mojgan Daneshmand and Pedram Musavi. Lots of my friends were in that airplane, and actually it could be me easily. Every year we travel to Iran to meet our family and coming back these days.
In honor of those who lost their lives in the Ukrainian plane crash, flags at city facilities in Lethbridge have been lowered to half-mast until tomorrow. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney met with Deputy Prime Minister Freeland in Calgary recently. Our legislative reporter Tyler Dawson says our Premier may be softening his stance a little when it comes to dealing with the Liberals in Ottawa.
I think to some extent there is the really good politics of being the cranky Premier in public, but at the end of the day, Premier Jason Kenney needs the federal government to sort of work with him on this stuff in a lot of ways. So I think we are seeing, if not a softening in relations, I suspect we're seeing a little more savvy politics maybe than we saw for the first half of the year when Jason Kenney was running to be Premier and was really, really, really bullish in his approach to how he was going to deal with Ottawa.
Tyler will have more on what that meeting means for Albertans. Catch that full interview coming up after business news. Last year was a busy time for Alberta law enforcement response teams. According to a recent release last year, alert teams across the province laid 1,402 criminal charges against 241 suspects. The group also seized more than $4 million worth of cash, $13 million worth of drugs, and took 92 firearms out of the hands of gang members and drug dealers. The biggest bust was a joint investigation with U.S. drug enforcement called Project Coyote. Over a 2-year period, Alert seized more than $15 million worth of drugs. Alert is mandated to address serious crime across Alberta and has regional offices set up in many jurisdictions, including Lethbridge, Medicine Hat, Red Deer, Calgary, and Edmonton. Lethbridge West MLA Shannon Phillips blasted Premier Jason Kenney and the UCP's budget at SACPA today. Phillips says Kenney needs to change his priorities to create more economic diversification.
Healthcare, education, seniors care, childcare, and making sure we diversify our economy to make our oil and gas jobs good jobs for the future, and making sure we are taking advantage of every other opportunity, whether it's renewable energy, whether it's upgrading into plastics and other things with our oil and gas products, whether it's digital media, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's the arts or the film industry. We have a number of strengths. Turning our backs on all of those industries, which Jason Kenney has done, in favor of one industry and looking in the rearview mirror is not a great way to build this province. And in fact, if you drive down the road looking in the rearview mirror the whole time, that is a very dangerous way to get to where you're going.
Phillips says the NDP would reverse cuts to healthcare and education and the $4.7 billion corporate tax cut. The Heart of Our City Committee announced today that it has awarded $126,000 to 21 events to be held in the downtown core of Lethbridge this year.
The Heart of Our City has been working diligently over the past 12 years to create vibrancy, excitement, new opportunities for our community to participate in downtown. We are a committee of council, and so through council we deliver on their goals, and so we're happy to be able to help them achieve their goals in seeing a revitalized downtown.
We are delighted once again at Lethbridge Shakespeare Performance Society to have been given an activity grant in order to present our Shakespeare in the Park Summer Festival.
More details on the events receiving activity grant funding in 2020 can be found on the City of Lethbridge website. The flu numbers are up in Lethbridge. Now that's according to Dr. Vivian Suttorp, who's with Alberta Health Services. Suttorp says there are 3 different strains of influenza circulating.
Influenza is an interesting type of virus, and there's many subtypes. And protection from one subtype doesn't protect you from the others. And this is why annually we need an influenza vaccine, because the strains and the subtypes change over time. So if you've been sick with one and you've had the influenza type illness and you've not been immunized, you can still get the others that are circulating. We've had outbreaks in facilities, in our continuing care facilities, for example, and we've had examples of outbreaks of all 3 strains. So unique is this year that we have all 3 strains circulating, and especially the influenza B strains, which often is more severe in children.
Dr. Suttorp says the message for prevention is simple. Stay home if you're sick, wash your hands, cough in your elbow, and immunize. She also says it's always important to clean around the house to prevent the spread of flu germs. Operation Red Nose wrapped up its 25th year and was another success in our city. On the last night, New Year's Eve, 94 safe rides home were provided, bringing the season total to 868 rides over a 10-night period. During the 2019 holiday season, the campaign was able to collect close to $22,000 in donations from patrons who used the service and another $18,400 in corporate donations. All of the proceeds collected will support the University of Lethbridge Pronghorns athletic programs. You may have noticed that gas has gone up 5 to 6 cents a litre at the pumps now that the federal carbon tax has kicked in. Apparently, the price may be coming back down tomorrow. Dan McTagg is the president of Canadians for Affordable Energy. He says there is more than one reason why.
Well, two pieces of good news, perhaps not if you're a producer, but certainly if you're a consumer. It has everything to do with the fact that we have seen a de-escalation of the tensions between the U.S. and Iran. And another little unknown factor that does need to get reported, the U.S. oil and gasoline inventory in particular rose by almost 10 million barrels. And that's one of the main reasons why we saw a rather dramatic and sudden and steep drop on the markets yesterday. And that, of course, means good news for consumers as prices are likely to drop net 3 cents a litre tomorrow. They could drop another penny by Saturday. The trend is definitely on the downward side.
That was Dan McTagg, president of Canadians for Affordable Energy. It appears today in Western culture that we may be a bit of a self-loathing nation, or blaming oneself for past societal wrongs. Many times we speak of white privilege and observe certain groups blaming others for their own lack of success. Mark Milkey, a public policy analyst, recently wrote a book called The Victim Cult. He discusses the victim culture mentality and how we should not live in the past but learn to move forward.
I think it's a real mistake to concentrate on the past, to almost obsessively so, and this is a problem with victim cults. When you obsess on the past, you may miss out on the real reasons why you or your society, whoever it is, beyond Aboriginal Canadians. My book takes a look at 1,000 years of history. Anyone, if you obsess on the past, you may miss out the real reason why you succeed or don't succeed today.
Mark will have more on how we can move on from feeling like victims and instead become victors. That's coming up in the second half of our show. The Saskatchewan government is working to prevent released sex offenders from changing their names. The province's Justice Minister, Don Morgan, says the rule change could take effect in February if approved by Cabinet. He says anyone who wants to change their name would go through a criminal record check. Morgan says the change would focus on people convicted of sexual offenses involving children and vulnerable adults. He says there are around 1,000 name changes each and every year in Saskatchewan. British lawmakers approved a bill today authorizing the country to depart from the European Union at the end of the month. The House of Commons voted 330 to 231 to pass the Withdrawal Agreement Bill, which sets the terms of Britain's departure from the 28-nation bloc. The majority won by Prime Minister Boris Johnson's Conservatives in last month's election helped to secure the bill's passage despite opposition of smaller parties. Britain and the EU will now launch into new negotiations to deal with trade, security, and a host of other areas by the end of the year. Despite the recent rains, many of the wildfires in Australia continue to burn out of control. Doug Schutz began volunteering with the Rural Fire Service in Australia's New South Wales state more than 50 years ago. Schutz, who has also been the victim of a wildfire which burned down his business on Christmas Day in 2001, says he loves volunteering. He says he became a volunteer in a unique way of giving back to his community.
The strategy of doing this backburn today, and that is to save this going any further east. It's still got probably another 10 to 12 kilometre run to the ocean, and that's the other fire break. This one just seems to have a mind of its own. It seems to have a brain, and it's a very sarcastic brain. It comes through from one direction, and tomorrow it'll come through the back door and grab you from behind. They're all local brigades here today: Basin View, St George's Basin, Tomarong, Wandandian, and no, none of them get paid. And that we're volunteers, probably how we like it, and it's our bit we do for the community. Some other people in some other countries and probably think, we're a bunch of idiots for living here, and that it's what we are, what we deal with, and that the Australian bush, although it's a lovely place to be, is very dangerous in its own right.
Samaritans Purse Australia has been helping in the fire-ravaged regions of New South Wales and Queensland for over 3 months now. As we hear in this next special report, the Christian organization is helping families on the road to recovery by providing a simple fire recovery kit.
Probably one of those things that you won't really notice or not really be able to put into words until after it's all over.
And once the fire started approaching the house, it was like we thought we were gone. We honestly thought we were gone. He's driving down the driveway, and the car down the bottom of the driveway blew up. Sorry. And I thought my husband had perished in the fire with that car blowing up. I thought it was our car that blew up.
I got nothing at all, and it just really had an effect on me. You know, go home and you turn the tap on and you think, well, you know, I've got running water, and then you think, well, I've actually got a house, you know.
Sometimes when we do even the smallest job for them, it seems to make a big impact. The consistent comments that we get back, even when we've done a very small job, is they say, wow, I feel a little more in control now. And they say, wow, I think I can see my way forward now.
Just recently, we just had no idea where to start. Like trees, fences. Well, there's no words that can describe the gratitude and the comfort of knowing that, you know, we don't have to do this on our own. That, you know, this is the start for us. And now that this is done, we can sort of start seeing a bit of light that will encourage us to keep going.
That was so nice to see. It was on this day that an unmanned probe lands on the moon, former U.S. President Richard Nixon is born, and the Phantom of the Opera becomes the longest-running Broadway show. This is Today in History for January the 9th.
But as president, I must put the interests of America first.
January 9th, 1913. President Richard Nixon is born in Yorba Linda, California. Nixon oversaw Cold War détente with the Soviet Union and China while winding down the Vietnam War. But he became the only president to ever resign, facing likely impeachment over the Watergate scandal. 1972. Reclusive billionaire Howard Hughes, speaking by phone from the Bahamas to reporters in Hollywood, says a purported biography of him is a fake. 1968. Surveyor 7, America's last unmanned probe of the moon, lands on the lunar surface. The following year, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin make history as the first humans to set foot on the moon. And 2006. In New York, the Phantom of the Opera leaps past Cats to become the longest-running show in Broadway history. Today in History, January 9th. Sandy Kozel, The Associated Press.
You know, I've seen Les Mis, Jersey Boys, but sadly, never Phantom of the Opera. It was cold and snowy again today. Make sure you have a block heater on standby. The mercury is dropping even further. A full look at the weather picture is coming up. Another snowy and cold day in the Windy City. Tonight, just a few clouds developing with a low near minus 19. Tomorrow, a mixture of sun and cloud with a high expected near minus 3. Saturday, overcast with a high of only minus 9. Cooling off even more under a cloudy sky on Sunday as the temperature will drop to minus 22. Monday, the mercury drops even further to minus 28. A good chance of flurries on Tuesday with high expected near minus 25. Wednesday, the clouds should clear out and we should get all the way up to minus 23. Checking the almanac, the average high for this time of year is minus 2 and an average low of minus 14. The highest temperature of this date was recorded in 1943 at 13 degrees and the record low minus 36 in 1949. Sunrise was at 8:27, sunset at 4:50. Looking at tomorrow's national forecast now, Victoria should receive rain and a high near 8 degrees. Expect snow mixed with rain for Vancouver and a high of 4. Increasing cloud and minus 5 degrees for Calgary on Friday. Mainly cloudy and a chilly minus 15 for Edmonton. Sunshine and minus 20 is on tap for Regina tomorrow. Sunny and minus 22 for Saskatoon. Expect a few clouds and a high of minus 19 degrees for Winnipeg. Periods of rain and a high of 8 degrees in Toronto tomorrow. Rain or drizzle and 6 for Ottawa. Mainly cloudy and 7 for Montreal. In the Maritimes, expect light flurries and 0 for Fredericton, New Brunswick. Rain mixed with snow and a high of 2 degrees for Halifax, Nova Scotia. Periods of light snow and 0 for Charlottetown, PEI. And in St. John's, Newfoundland, where there was a wind warning today, tomorrow expect lots of sunshine and a high near minus 7. Oil sands producer Synovus Energy is joining other oil companies promising to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050. The Calgary-based firm says it will reduce its emissions per barrel by 30% by 2030. Spanish energy giant Repsol, which has operations in Canada, announced a net zero target by 2050. Fellow oil sands producer Canadian Natural Resources has pledged to work towards that goal without giving a specific date. The annual rate of housing starts slowed last month, coming in well below expectations. Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation says the rate of starts was just over 197,000 in December. That is down more than 3% from November. Analysts on average had expected an annual rate of 210,000. The overall drop came as the pace of urban starts slowed 4%. German automaker Audi is showing its concept of a car of the future at a technology show in Las Vegas. The autonomous AI Me was launched last year, but at a show it offered rides in the self-driving vehicle for the first time.
Audi AMI is a level 4 autonomous car. This is a specific car for the urban cities, for the mega cities of the future, especially for the Asian market. We have the steering wheel, it's more like a steering unit. If the car is maybe on the autonomous mode, it gives you this kind of physical assistant, we call it, the tray in the perfect position where you can maybe reading a book or you can use something for work. These are opportunities we want to share as soon as possible. For us, it's also very important to get the feedback by the customer, by the public, how ready everybody is already for that. But these specific concept cars we did the last 2 years show some opportunities, but it doesn't mean that everything what we did here will 100% be in production.
Also at the CES Technology Show in Vegas, an inventor has come out with a way to hopefully make life safer for those who ride bikes and scooters with the invention of scooter turn signals.
You have a remote control here and the module mobile. You put it on your back like this. It's very easy and you have the signalization on your back.
What will they think of next? Now, here's a look at today's markets. The TSX was up almost 68 points on the day to 17,235. The Dow Jones Industrial Average was up almost 212 points to 28,956. The S&P 500 was up almost 22 points to 3274, and the Nasdaq was up 74 points to 9203. Oil was unchanged at $59.61 per barrel. Natural gas was up 3 cents to $2.17. Gold was down 2 cents to $15.5230 an ounce, and silver was also down 2 cents on the day to $17.88 an ounce. Wheat is at $229 per metric ton, barley's at $232, canola's at $469, and corn is at $282 per metric ton. Live cattle were up 38 cents on the day to $127.18. Feeder cattle were up 10 cents to $147.53. Lean hogs were down $2 to $69. The Canadian dollar was down slightly on the day to 76.58 US. Recapping one of our top stories this hour, reports say a surface-to-air missile is what brought down Ukrainian Airlines Flight 752 in Tehran, Iran. In total, 176 people were killed, including 63 Canadians. Half of the Canadians who died were from Edmonton. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney had a productive meeting with Deputy Prime Minister Freeland in Calgary recently. Our legislative reporter Tyler Dawson will have details next. But first, here's a look what's happening in and around your community.
Here's your Bridge City News community calendar. The Christmas Tree Recycling Program runs annually in January and is taking place Saturday, January 11th. To have your tree picked up, have it cleared of all decorations, tinsel or plastic, and place it nearby your regular garbage collection location by 7 a.m. Saturday morning. The City of Lethbridge and local youth groups partner together to collect trees to be chipped for environmentally friendly mulch. For more information, visit lethbridge.ca. The Troyanda Ukrainian Dance Club is celebrating Ukrainian New Year's Saturday, January 18th at the German Canadian Club. The festivities will feature a special performance by the Troyanda Dance Club, followed by a Ukrainian dinner with pierogies, sausage, cabbage rolls, and more. Plus, live music by Ukrainian band Absolute. The evening also includes a silent auction, raffles, games, and a midnight lunch. Tickets are $55 and can be purchased by calling Donna at 403-315-3492. The Lethbridge Association of the Blind provides numerous activities for the blind and visually impaired in the Lethbridge area. These events include dinners with entertainment, local museum tours, and much more. For more information, call 403-942-1677 or email brownwj@shaw.ca. And that's your Bridge City News Community Calendar.
63 Canadians, including many Albertans, lost their lives tragically when the Ukrainian passenger jet went down earlier this week in Iran. In total, 176 people lost their lives. Of those who died, many were from the Iranian-Canadian community. Joining me now to talk about it is the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Tyler, some of those who died in the crash were actually students who were attending the University of Alberta in Edmonton.
Yeah, that's right. So of those 63 Canadians who were killed, roughly half of them were from Edmonton, actually. And of that 30 or so, a large percentage of them were from the University of Alberta. So 2 of them were a newlywed couple who had been in Iran getting married. They were on their way home with members of their bridal party and people who had gone to the wedding. There were 2 professors in the engineering department at the university who were killed. They were with their children. So just, all around an enormous tragedy for the Iranian-Canadian community here and for everyone. I mean, there's not very many degrees of separation here, I think. That's a lot of people died from Canada in this crash.
Yeah, very sad, absolutely. Tyler, Premier Jason Kenney recently offered his condolences to the families of those who lost their lives. Now, speaking of Kenney, he recently met with the Deputy Prime Minister, Freeland, in Calgary. Was it a polite and friendly get-together? What did they talk about?
Well, it seems like it. So you may recall there was a meeting last year, I suppose now is the way to phrase it, when Freeland had come up to Edmonton and they, said the right things and had a polite get together. And the tone, as far as I could tell, was roughly the same as that. So Jason Kenney still reiterating that he has concrete demands in terms of, getting TMX built and having repeals or changes to bills C-69 and C-48, things like that. And this, of course, comes on the backdrop of the carbon tax coming back. And so, I think, again, we've talked about this before. I think to some extent there is the really good politics of being the cranky premier in public. But at the end of the day, Premier Jason Kenney needs the federal government to sort of work with him on this stuff in a lot of ways. So I think we are seeing if not a softening in relations, I suspect we're seeing a little more savvy politics maybe than we saw for the first half of the year when Jason Kenney was running to be premier and was really, really, really bullish in his approach to how he was going to deal with Ottawa.
But that plays to the voter base at the same time. You want to get that support. But, he's a former Harper cabinet minister, so he knows how to play the game in Ottawa. So it's, something you have to play both sides. Yeah.
I think people often forget how long he has been in politics and what a pro he is. All across the political spectrum, I think people have a lot of admiration for his political abilities, whether they agree with his politics or not, for sure.
Now, a UN committee has called for the halt of the TMX pipeline, citing racism. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so it seems to have been an agreement that was reached among, I believe it's a 16-member UN committee back in December. And the Canadian Press had the story earlier this week, and they want the halt basically of 3 projects. They want TMX halted, they want the Coastal GasLink project halted, and the Site C Dam, which I believe is in Newfoundland and Labrador. And the idea basically is that the Indigenous groups along the routes have not given their free, prior, and informed consent, which is what this UN committee wants. So what they are asking for is a halt to construction and going back to these groups to get full consent. Now, of course, there have been court challenges from various Indigenous groups about the consultation process on the TMX line. That's what halted construction. Goodness, a year and a half ago now, I guess it would be. So so that has obviously been an issue domestically as well. Now, the government of Alberta has sort of hit back saying, well, there have been negotiations done. There's agreements with the majority of Indigenous groups along these routes. But it also reflects, I think, in some ways, some of the divides within the Indigenous community. The example being the Wet'suwet'en group in British Columbia, where the hereditary chiefs do not want the pipeline construction, the Coastal GasLink pipeline construction, and the elected chiefs are more in favor of it. So it's a complicated scenario, and a weird story that has got people kind of worked up in terms of the practical changes it will make. I haven't seen any indication yet that it truly matters. I don't think that construction is going to halt just because the UN committee suggested that it should.
The province of Alberta made a big move in December, reducing surgical wait times, Tyler. Close to 70,000 Albertans were waiting for surgery as of May of last year. How is the government going to actually help cut down on these wait times?
Yeah, so the idea seems to be that they're going to contract out with private clinics and surgical centers. There is already a lot of surgeries done this way in Alberta. Cataract surgery is, I think, probably the best example of it. But the idea is that you can sort of divert some people from the public system waiting list, and these necessary surgeries will still be paid for by the government, but the idea is that it's going to make things faster. We're not talking about a tremendously huge increase over the next few years, but that is their plan, to reduce wait times in large part. And of course, union groups and the New Democrats saying that this is a step towards American-style healthcare and things like that. So that debate is unlikely to stop at any point, especially as we go into contract negotiations and things like that in the next year or two. But that's their plan for now. And as you said, 70,000 people, that's a long waiting list if you're in pain and waiting for surgery.
Absolutely. An Alberta Pro-Life Association won a court battle against a $17,500 security fee. This decision will impact students across the province. Can you explain?
Yeah, so this one, you have to dredge back a little bit in history for this. So this goes back to a protest in 2015 when the pro-life group at the University of Alberta had a demonstration. There was a counter-demonstration. The group wanted the counter-demonstrators charged with sort of breaking the student code. And at the same time, they'd applied to hold another protest sometime in 2016. The university came back and said, look, well, we had this, sort of raucous standoff between two groups. You need to foot the bill for security if you want to have this event. Now, the student group said, well, there's no way we can afford a $17,500 bill. So they sued the university, saying that, this amounts to a prohibition on our speech. We are being singled out and things like that. The lower court in Alberta, the Court of Queen's Bench, said absolutely not. Said that this is not, sort of a decision that can be reviewed by the courts. This student group, and they were represented by the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, which is run by John Carpe. They went to the top court in Alberta, the Alberta Court of Appeals. Now, what they said was, for the purposes of this sort of event, the university is a government body. So, of course, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms applies to government. Government restricting freedom of expression is the problem as far as the charter is concerned. And so in this instance, a university counts as a governmental body, which means that any restriction on free expression becomes a little bit hairier. So, this doesn't totally matter in some ways because, of course, the students who sued have since graduated, and so they can't go back in time and hold this protest. But what they can do is the next time a protest comes up, an application for a protest or some such, the University of Alberta is going to have to think about what the Alberta Court of Appeal said when it's making its consideration on something like security costs. They were basically told that the security cost thing was a little bit unreasonable. There were perhaps other alternatives. They could have put up fences, things like that. So in terms of on-campus protest, it could have implications for how things are determined. And of course, people have been talking as well about the new free speech commitments on university campuses that the UCP asked for. And I put in a call to the government and asked them about that. And they said, well, this is actually a university thing. It's a court thing. We're not. So they didn't really comment on it. But this is happening against the recent issue of free speech on university campuses.
Tyler, the carbon tax is back. Many Albertans are not happy about it. I noticed the price of the pumps went up, about 5 cents a litre, and I can't wait to see my natural gas bill for January with the cold temperatures we're getting here. Now, the carbon tax is currently, $20 per tonne, but it's going up to $30 a tonne in April. What will that mean for the average Albertan like yourself and myself?
Yeah. So I rent an apartment, so I don't have to pay a natural gas bill at all. Just I don't have to worry about it too much.
Sure.
Lucky guy, yeah. So what it will do at the pumps probably is add a few more cents to that. So I think the calculation was supposed to be around 4.5 cents when the government was analyzing it. That is a little less than the 7 or so cents that we saw last year when the carbon tax was in place. So yes, those little costs will go up. Not so little costs depending what your job is and where you live. Obviously, down in Lethbridge, lots of people in agriculture and people living in rural areas that this affects a lot more than me in downtown Edmonton, where I can walk to do everything. So that's what's the situation there. And the other thing is that the rebates are coming from the federal government. So even though the carbon tax in Alberta, the federal one, has just started, Albertans are eligible for a carbon tax rebate on their taxes, which amounts to about $444 for an adult, and then it goes down to $222 or something to that effect for dependents and children and so on. So it's going to maybe be a little different at tax season for people. People are going to feel it at the pumps and on their bills a little bit. And of course, the province is vowing to keep fighting in court against this, unsurprisingly.
Right. Now, there's some concern that policing costs are going to be downloaded by the UCP onto rural municipalities, and that's going to be a bit of an issue, budgeting problem for Lethbridge City Council next year, as they'll be starting off the year with around $240,000 in extra costs.
That's right. So basically what the situation is right now for smaller municipalities and rural counties is that the province pays 70% of the RCMP policing costs, and the federal government pays 30, I believe. I may have those backwards now that I think about it. But at any rate, the province and the federal government cover the costs. What is happening now is there's going to be 10% of the cost that is going to be phased in and covered by municipalities. So for Lethbridge County, as you said, that's about $240,000. It'll be larger numbers elsewhere. The county, Wetaskiwin County, had some concerns about this last month. So that this is, of course, in response to the rural crime stuff. There's going to be more police boots on the ground. That was the plan here. But, those things cost money. And so the UCP's decision was that municipalities were going to be kicking in a bit more on it. So not colossal numbers by any stretch of the imagination, but of course, if you're a municipality of 5,000 people or something, then these numbers start to become a little bit more difficult, I think.
Absolutely. Now, there's been a little bit of controversy surrounding the UCP's War Room and a logo for the Canadian Energy Centre. The NDP, Tyler, they want to see the War Room shut down altogether. Big surprise.
Yeah, so well, indeed, right? So they held a press conference, New Year's press conference kind of thing, and one of their first shots out of the gate here was, this thing is a boondoggle, it's an embarrassment, it's mired in controversy, it's not being taken seriously. For $82,000 a day, you might as well just shut it down. And as you said, there's been a controversy over their logo, which ended up being held by another company. There were sort of rumors circulating about their current logo being very similar, but nothing has really gone anywhere on that. And they've, had a couple social media feuds where statistics and facts have been in dispute. Now, I asked the Justice Minister, Doug Schweitzer, who is on the board of the Canadian Energy Centre, which is the proper name for the War Room, and he thinks they're doing a bang-up job. And Christine Myatt, the Premier's spokeswoman, told the Calgary Herald recently that it was a bit rocky out of the gate and they would have preferred it to go more smoothly, but they're more or less happy with what is being done there. Now, as media members, we are in an interesting position because in some ways I think they're a competitor of ours, or they're trying to be. They wanted to be thought of as like a media startup when they began. But we also don't have very much access to things like their financials and their strategy planning and stuff like that, where we normally would through freedom of information with government bodies. So it's been kind of an interesting scenario. And as I say, controversy, the NDP wants it shut down, unsurprisingly. The UCP standing behind it, unsurprisingly. So I think that's something to keep an eye out for in the next year, actually, is to what extent the War Room begins to have an impact maybe on the discourse about oil and gas in this province.
The war over the War Room continues.
Yes, indeed.
The Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, thanks a lot for joining me today from Edmonton.
Pleasure, Hal.
It appears as though a lot of today's Western culture seems self-loathing, blaming itself for past societal wrongs such as slavery. Now, we speak of white privilege and observe people groups blaming others for their own lack of success. Joining me now to talk about this from Calgary is Mark Milke, a public policy analyst and author of The Victim Cult, How the Culture of Blame Hurts Everyone and Wrecks Civilizations. Mark, it's a fascinating book. In a nutshell, how does the past really hurt or wreck civilizations?
Well, you can learn the wrong lessons from the past is the problem, right? So for example, Bill Clinton, just after the 9/11 attacks, said, look, part of the reason the 9/11 attacks happened was due to the Crusades 1,000 years before. To say this was a stretch understates it massively. What Clinton didn't understand and didn't know actually is that the Muslim world forgot entirely about the Crusades until the 1860s, when Europeans brought it up in a way to try and say, you know, this is a result, colonialism is bad, here's an example of it. So actually the Muslim world forgot about it for 8.5 centuries until Europeans brought it back to life, ironically enough. And to blame something on the past is a problem often, not always, but often a problem because you may miss out on the real reason you or someone else has a problem. And in fact, sometimes it gives people a reason to escape their own responsibility. And that's problematic as well individually. But the victim cult is really about that. It's about, imagine, we all know someone who thinks like a victim, rightly or wrongly. Maybe they were a victim, maybe they weren't. They weren't. But multiply that by millions of people when you have entire societies stuck kind of in a grievance narrative, as I call it in the victim cult, then you've got a real problem because they're not looking to improve themselves or really look for what causes current problems. And that's a big problem with grievance narratives.
So what really motivated you to write the book? Did you experience a lot of wrongs yourself in the past?
Well, I mean, everybody has those examples in their own lives, or you look at your parents, right? My parents had a tough time in the 1980s in Kelowna, where I grew up, right? Bank of Canada interest rates shot up to 20%. My parents lost their house and they never really recovered financially. So everyone has something in their past, or, you know, their family's past or their friends. There's no shortage of actual victimization, and I don't downplay that in the victim cult. But the book started 8 years ago with an observation. I'd done a lot of policy work on Native issues in Canada, on First Nations, and I noticed a big difference between those reserves that were successful and those that were not. And a lot of it had to do with some First Nations leaders, and I emphasize only some, but some First Nations leaders who always look back to the past and always blame current circumstances on the past. They go back 50 years or 100 years or 200 years. Now, the problem with that is you miss out on real reasons why something is wrong today. So let me give you a clear example. We know, for example, that Aboriginal Canadians on average earn less than other Canadians, but that doesn't really get into the details and show you where people succeed. So for example, if you look at young adults that are aged 25 to 34, it doesn't matter whether you're Aboriginal or any other Canadian. And if you got a university degree, for example, you earn almost the exact same, and in some cases higher. The higher you go in the educational ladder. An Aboriginal Canadian will actually earn, on average, higher than other Canadians if you've got a post-secondary degree, something beyond rather bachelor's. So why are Aboriginal Canadians on average poorer than other Canadians? It has a lot to do with geography. Reserves are often in the middle of nowhere. There's no educational opportunities, or very few, right, beyond high school. And the geography also limits the ability to earn an income. If your reserve is a flying reserve in northern Manitoba, you're not going to have the economic opportunities other Canadians do. In other words, don't blame 100 years ago on today, blame geography, blame education. Now, the good thing about that, the positive thing for Aboriginal Canadians, is you can move, you can get an education. Those are correctable, right? You may need to move from a remote location like any other Canadian, right? So these things are not set in stone. And so I think it's a real mistake to concentrate, as bad as some things that have been in the past. I think it's a real mistake to concentrate on the past, to almost obsessively so. And this is a problem with victim cults. When you obsess on the past, you may miss out on the real reasons why you or your society, whoever it is, beyond Aboriginal Canadians. My book takes a look at 1,000 years of history. Anyone, if you obsess on the past, you may miss out the real reason why you succeed or don't succeed today.
What about people who use the victim card as a tool of sorts? It's like, your ancestors did this to my ancestors, so now you owe me.
Yeah. There's a good example in the victim cult. I go into a lot of history. There's some Canadian examples, but let me give you one example from history that I think most people are familiar with, or at least the later years. Most people are familiar with Germany after 1933, Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. And even in the 1920s, where Germans blamed their problems on how World War I ended, the Weimar Treaty, the Versailles Treaty, and responses by the Allies to the Germans. There was a lot of blame going on after the First World War in Germany itself, blaming the Allies, blaming others. And this actually led to the possibility for Adolf Hitler to rise to power in 1933 and the Nazis on kind of a narrative of blame, surfing blame, you could say, into power. What most people are not aware of is it didn't start in 1933, and it didn't start with the end of the First World War. It didn't start in the 1920s. Germans blamed others for more than a century. Germany was originally occupied in the late 17th century by France, southern and western Germany. And when the Germans finally ejected the French from German territories in the early 1800s, they rightly blamed some of their problems on the French. The French were quite brutal to Germans, right? I mean, it was war and all the atrocities you can imagine, war from rape to pillage to just stealing of property occurred. I mean, it was an awful time for Germans who had been occupied by the French for the most part. Now, the problem was that even after Germans ejected the French from German soil, Germans became, I don't know how else to describe it, paranoid, conspiratorial. They thought of themselves as permanent victims. So they thought of themselves not only as victims of the French, which they had been, but they started to look around and think, okay, now that we're a country again, or we're kind of a contiguous territory, how do we make Germany great again? There's no other way to put it. Well, they lapsed into notions of pure culture. And this excluded a lot of people. If you weren't Protestant, if you weren't born in Germany, you could never be a true German in their view. And they blamed not only the French, but they blamed Jews, of course. This started early on in the 1800s. And they went from kind of a religious anti-Semitism to really a philosophical anti-Semitism. Germans didn't like the English. They didn't like capitalism. They didn't like British liberalism. So there's a whole host of people and ideas that Germans were afraid of, that they thought were bad influences. And they became paranoid about contamination of true Germanhood. And this went on for a century, more than a century, before actually they got into, about half a century before they got into racial theories about purity as well, which just made it all that much worse.
You know, I think there's a place for governments to apologize for past wrongs, but should there be an end to it at some point in time? Our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has made a lot of apologies for past societal wrongs, but should we forgive and move on at some point in time?
Well, I'm conflicted on this, and I think you have to be very specific about what you're apologizing for. I'm not sure that actually politicians apologizing do much to add to the stock of human compassion. I could be wrong, but I think, look, by the time a politician apologizes for something on behalf of the country, it may be that the country has already moved on. I mean, by the time you apologize for what we did to Japanese Canadians in the 1980s, for example, when Prime Minister Brian Mulroney apologized for that, I think almost every Canadian would think putting the Japanese Canadians in internment camps in World War II was an awful injustice, a tragedy, a willful tragedy by politicians and others of the day. But nonetheless, I mean, the real work here is actually in the details. So, for example, there was some compensation to Japanese Canadians in the 1950s, but not really enough to make up for the property that we'd stolen from them, the government stole from them in the 1940s. It was only really a partial compensation. So if you're going to apologize, I think it has to be, and attribute blame, I think it has to be very tight, very direct. So for example, you've been hurt or harmed by the government. I mean, we do this every day. If the government takes your property, expropriates your property, you can go to court and say, I want my money for that property. Or generally, governments in advance of that will pay you out for your property. But if they do something unjust, you can go to the courts and sue them. So I think if it's you or maybe your parents, but the further you go back, the more difficult it becomes to say, you owe me, right? Or your ancestors owe me, and somehow your ancestors hurt my ancestors, and thus you owe me. So a good example of this is it's a debate in the U.S. right now. Should there be compensation for slavery, which ended in 1865 at the end of the Civil War? I think that's a stretch for a whole bunch of reasons that I point out in the victim cult. I think that really goes way beyond what I call a reasonable statute of limitations.
You also have a chapter that explains how the evangelical Christians led the charge to abolish slavery. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, and I put this chapter in the victim cult because, again, if we're gonna have debates about your ancestors harmed my ancestors, and we all owe each other somehow, that becomes really complicated, difficult to sort out. It's difficult enough today to sort out in a courtroom, right? When you're alleged to have done wrong, I mean, faulty memories, witnesses have different accounts. It's difficult enough in the modern day to sort through who's right or wrong or who's to blame or who should be convicted in a courtroom, never mind going back 150 years. But if we're going to play this game, let's at least try and weigh both sides of the scale, right? So, for example, these days it's popular to beat up on British imperialists, right? British colonialists. Now, look, no empire is perfect, no country is perfect, no person is perfect. Once you grasp that or admit that, then you have to go, okay, in addition to, some bad things the British Empire did, I mean, nobody likes to be occupied by an empire. The fact is, it was the British imperialists and it was evangelical Christians in specific in that empire, whether in Great Britain itself or in Canada or the northern United States. They're the ones who came up with the idea that slavery happens to be wrong. It happens to be an injury to human beings who are made in the image of God. That was what Christian evangelicals thought, and they acted on that belief, and they fought against the current, not only of their time, but of all of human history where slavery had not been opposed, really, by other than a few maybe philosophers in ancient Greece. So it was a remarkable, courageous stand that evangelicals began to take in the late 18th century. William Wilberforce, a lot of your viewers will be familiar with that name, the Christian evangelical parliamentarian in Great Britain, who began in the 1780s to oppose slavery, root and branch, and he spent his entire political career, decades, fighting slavery. And of course, the British Empire was the first to abolish slavery domestically among European countries, and then to abolish it in the Empire of 1833, 32 years before the Americans did. There's an unknown history in Canada where some of our colonial governors in the late 1700s take a cue from William Wilberforce and oppose slavery in the Atlantic colonies, in Upper Canada, in Lower Canada. They took their cue from William Wilberforce, and by the time slavery was outlawed in 1833 across the empire, i.e. including Canada, Canadians didn't pay any compensation to slaves because for the most part, it was done with in Canada a couple of decades before.
Mark, Asian Canadians and Americans also experienced discrimination. But interestingly, this people group had an amazing success compared to other people groups. What did they do that was so different?
Right. I wanted to, in the victim cult, not only look again at the problem of victimhood, I wanted to study those who were victimized and then how they responded, right? How did they avoid getting stuck? Because again, in the victim cult, I don't deny that victimization happens in history or now. So the question is, what do you do about it? Well, the good example comes from East Asian arrivals to the Pacific coast, both Canada and the United States, starting around 1850. In the case of the United States, around the time of the gold rush in California, massive immigration by the Chinese, 2 or 3 decades later by the Japanese. In both cases, heavily discriminated against in the United States as they were in Canada. Couldn't hold certain professions, couldn't get citizenship. This lasts for over a century in various forms, that kind of institutional discrimination against Chinese, Canadians, and Americans and the Japanese as well, including native-born Japanese and Chinese in the United States and Canada. All right, so what did they do then? Well, for one thing, they didn't make the mistake of saying we're only victims, there's nothing we could do. That's really debilitating. If you're always blaming someone else and saying, I'm only what you say I am, that actually is really harmful to you and you as a society and your community, your tribe, so to speak. Asian Canadians and Asian Americans fought back. They didn't accept the treatment as much as they could. There's some great stories about how early Chinese Americans go all the way to the Supreme Court to get what rights they could, and in some cases succeed. There's a wonderful example of a Chinese American who writes to the governor of California and says, America is only for whites. And this Chinese American writes to the governor, John Engler, and says, this is false in the extreme, and you know it. And it was a very articulate letter in response to the governor of California, saying, we Chinese Americans are every bit as worthy of citizenship as you with white skin. So they fought back. They also did some other interesting things. Purposefully or just as part of the cultural response, Chinese and Japanese, Canadians and Americans always placed a high emphasis in education. So one of the fascinating things I discovered in research for the victim cult was by 1920 and by 1930, Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans, their children were graduating at rates higher than white Americans from high school and from college. And why does this matter? Because it set the foundations right then and beyond for the future success of Asian Americans. And the same thing happened in Canada, but the statistics were there for the United States for the most part. And you see that really provides a foundation for Asian American success and Asian Canadian success.
Mark Mielke, author of The Victim Cult, thanks for joining me from Calgary today.
Thank you, Hal.
And on behalf of all of us here at BCN, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless, and thanks so much for watching.